The issue of Miracleman's ownership is a complicated, jumbled mess. It's one of the most serious rabbit holes one can fall down concerning comic books. Until very recently, who actually owned the rights to the character were murky at best. Now, my intent is to summarize and to simplify, to the best of my understanding, all the major elements that make this case an unbelievable, convoluted mess. And I did my best to get the facts straight and to not misrepresent anyone's views or opinions. Furthermore, I'm not a legal expert, so there may be some finer aspects of copyright and trademark law that I might not have absolutely correct. With that disclaimer in place, let me add an acknowledgement. Two sources were invaluable to this video essay: Poisoned Chalice, originally published on The Beat, and Kimota, the Miracleman companion. Both are highly recommended for further, in-depth information. In 1941, DC sued Fawcett Publications, claiming their Captain Marvel character was an indirect ripoff of their character, Superman. This copyright infringement case would drag on over the next 12 years. During the span of this legal case, public interest in superheroes dwindled and sales for this genre began to decline. This factor, coupled with the cost of a trial, essentially forced Fawcett Publications to shut down in 1953. The company continued to operate, but it abandoned publishing superhero material. This was bad news to the British publishing company L. Miller & Son, who had licensed the right to publish black and white reprints of the Captain Marvel titles from Fawcett. These were successful, profitable titles for L. Miller & Son, and they weren't too thrilled about losing their cash cow. The publisher contacted writer-slash-artist Mick Anglo, and they asked him to create a new British superhero that was essentially indistinguishable from Captain Marvel. By swapping in this Captain Marvel clone, the publishing company hoped they would maintain the audience that had been buying the Captain Marvel reprint comics. This led to the creation of Marvelman. The similarities between Captain Marvel and Marvelman were hard to miss. Both superheroes gained their powers from mysterious older men. They transformed into their superhero selves by uttering a magical word. And they both had a supporting cast of similarly powered family members. Since Fawcett, the owners of Captain Marvel, had their hands full going out of business, this British ripoff was never legally challenged, even though it was a very obvious clone. The Adventures of Marvelman would be published weekly from 1953 until 1960, whereupon Mick Anglo stopped producing Marvelman material. Marvelman and the spin-off series Kid Marvelman and the Marvelman Family became monthly reprint titles at that point. These series would be discontinued 3 years later in 1963 when the publishing company ceased printing comics altogether. L. Miller & Son would continue on until it went out of business in 1973. Mick Anglo continued to produce a variety of comic book material until he retired in the 1980s. And here's where the confusion over the ownership of Marvelman truly begins. Mick Anglo had claimed that he owned the Marvelman character right from the beginning, and there is scant evidence to support the validity of that claim. He is, most certainly, the creator of the character, but during that period of comic book publishing, it was extremely rare for the creative talent to own the work they produced. The rights to a character almost always lay with the publishing company. Since leaving the Marvelman title, Mick Anglo has claimed on a few occasions that Marvelman was his property, and, at the time Mick Anglo made those claims, L. Miller & Son had stopped publishing Marvelman stories and, quite possibly, either didn't care what Mick Anglo claimed, or they simply never noticed he had made any claim. It really didn't matter either way, since the character was well on its way to becoming a footnote in British comic book history. Notably, L. Miller & Son did continue to publish reprints of the Mick Anglo Marvelman material for 3 years following his departure from the series. It seems unlikely they would have done this unless they owned the rights to the material and the character. So, Mick Anglo's claim is suspect, but there is enough of a gray area that his claim can't be dismissed outright. In time, this gray area would become massive. Des Skin, an editor that had been working at Marvel UK, left his position to begin the British comics anthology Warrior. Something Skin wanted to do was to revive the Marvelman character in Warrior. After offering the character to 2 other writers, Skin settled on Alan Moore, a writer who was gaining attention with Captain Britain at Marvel UK. After some research to acquire the rights to Marvelman, Des Skin came to the conclusion that no one owned the rights. The character had essentially become public domain when the publishing company, L. Miller & Son, went out of business in the early 70s. So by simply publishing new Marvelman material, Des could re-establish copyright and own the character. Des then contacted Mick Anglo and asked if they could integrate some of his older Marvelman material with the new content they intended to create. Anglo agreed. One of the tenets Skin established for Warrior was the creators would own their own material. This would be incentive for creators to produce material for Warrior, since publishers almost always retained ownership. The creators might not make a guaranteed page rate, but at the end of the day, they would have full rights to the material they produced. The only exception to this was Marvelman. The writer, Alan Moore, would get a 40% share of the character. The artist, Gary Leach, would get an equal 40% share. The remaining 20% would be owned by Skin. So any profits from merchandising or licensing Marvelman in comics or any other media would be split between these three people. To be clear, these shares all pertain to the Marvelman character and all related characters, like Kid Miracleman and Dr. Garganza. The rights to the actual scripts and artwork remained with the respective creator. So, Alan Moore owned the writing outright, and Gary Leach owned the artwork outright. Skin had no claim to either the writing or artwork. This is an issue that gets even more complicated once Gary Leach left the series and was replaced by Alan Davis. Davis, who was also working with Alan Moore on Captain Britain, didn't want to take on the artwork chores unless he also had a stake in the Marvelman character. So it was decided that everyone would give up a 10% share and give that share to Davis for his participation. So for those trying to keep score, Alan Moore, Gary Leach, and Alan Davis all owned 30% of Marvelman and all related characters. The remaining 10% was owned by Des Skin, and, naturally, Davis fully owned the rights to the artwork he produced. Marvelman then appeared over 17 installments in the first 21 issues of Warrior. During this run, Moore and Skin had a clash of personalities over the Marvelman content. Specifically, Skin insisted that Moore incorporate the Big Ben character within the story. This was an editorial decision Moore disagreed with, but he incorporated it nonetheless. At the same time, Davis began withholding new artwork when payment for his prior work was late. So, the three people working on Marvelman were not getting along at all. The ongoing and escalating issues led to the Marvelman story stopping on a cliffhanger in the 21st issue of Warrior. The various disagreements among the creative talent and the publisher led to the possibility that this character would once again return to comic book limbo. Coincidentally, while these conflicts led to the comic being indefinitely delayed, Marvel Comics contacted Skin and threatened legal action. Their objection being the Marvelman name was an infringement on their trademark. Skin printed the letters from Marvel Comics' legal team in Warrior. The implication being, the reason Marvelman was no longer appearing in Warrior was due to legal harassment from Marvel, rather than the fact that the creative team had suspended production. And, when Warrior stopped being published with issue 26, the further implication could be made that Marvel Comics was responsible for Warrior shutting down. Implications aside, none of that is actually true. While Marvel did send letters expressing their concern over the Marvelman name, no legal action was taken. Warrior stopped being published because it wasn't successful, despite the critical praise it received. Before the magazine shut down, Des Skin tried to expand the Warrior content into other markets, specifically into North America. He made a deal with Eclipse Comics that would allow them to reprint the Marvelman series. But Eclipse didn't want to reprint an incomplete Saga. So they began to negotiate with Alan Moore to see if he would be willing to finish the story he abandoned the previous year. Moore was interested, but he stipulated that both Gary Leach and Alan Davis had to give their expressed written permission to reprint the material they had previously drawn before he would submit new scripts to Eclipse. Basically, Moore wanted to ensure the deal with Eclipse was above board and that all the talent got paid their due. Little deviation here, but it's definitely relevant. As previously mentioned, Moore and Davis had also collaborated on Captain Britain for Marvel UK. Notably, both owned the rights to their material. At roughly the same time that Marvel contacted Skin concerning the Marvelman name, Marvel also expressed a desire to reprint the Captain Britain material. But Moore was not interested. He wouldn't allow the material to be reprinted due to Marvel challenging the Marvelman name. This effectively screwed Davis out of a decent paycheck and some good exposure to a North American audience. This did not sit well with Davis, which led to some bad blood between the two Allens. This disagreement explains why Moore and Davis weren't directly communicating during the Eclipse negotiations. End of deviation. Eclipse Comics assured Moore they had secured the rights from both Leach and Davis, but they produced no paperwork to prove this claim. After some convincing, Moore accepted this verbal confirmation on faith. He signed a contract and began to write new scripts. However, Eclipse hadn't secured the rights from anyone but Des Skin. It would be Eclipse's position that Skin was representing the talent involved and that he had their permission to sell the reprint rights. So to make deals with the various artists was basically unnecessary, from Eclipse's point of view. For the record, Alan Davis was never compensated by Eclipse when they used his artwork for their reprint series. At this point, Warrior is now out of business. Moore is writing new Miracleman scripts, and the Eclipse reprints have begun. For the reprints, it's decided to change the name of the character from Marvelman to Miracleman to avoid any potential legal hassle from Marvel Comics. The saga is rather straightforward until Moore finishes his run on Miracleman with issue 16. At this point, Moore contacted Neil Gaiman and asked him if he wanted to continue on with the series, despite the fact that he'd left the character at a point where no further stories are necessary and possibly can't happen anyway. Gaiman accepted this challenge. Moore gracefully gave, this has to be underscored, Alan Moore gave Neil Gaiman his 30% share of the Miracleman character. He was under no obligation to do so. He did it because it was the right thing to do. It was a very generous gesture from one creator to another. Gaiman then gave the artist of his run on Miracleman, Mark Buckingham, a 15% share of the character, keeping the remaining 15% for himself. Again, this is a gesture of respect that needs to be acknowledged. Skipping ahead even more, because nothing changes for a few years, Gaiman writes the Miracleman series until issue 24. Then Eclipse Comics abruptly went out of business. Here enters the final player in this legal drama, Todd McFarlane. His accomplishments are well known and require very little elaboration. Briefly, McFarlane was immensely popular in 1996, and he was making a load of money with his comic book, Spawn, and his toy company, McFarlane Toys. After Eclipse went out of business and filed for bankruptcy, all of the company's assets were sold off to pay its debts. One of those assets was Miracleman. McFarlane purchased the character rights and all other material related to Miracleman. Here's where the saga takes a lot of twists and turns, which requires a deviation into McFarlane and Neil Gaiman's prior working relationship. Gaiman had written an issue of Spawn for McFarlane years prior. In that single issue, Gaiman created the characters Angela, Cogliostro, and Medieval Spawn. These characters were subsequently used by McFarlane and other creators in Spawn and in other Spawn-related titles. Gaiman himself wrote a 3-issue Angela miniseries that McFarlane published. Due to their friendly handshake agreement, McFarlane was obligated to pay Gaiman every time any of these characters were used. It was Gaiman's understanding he owned 50% of each of these characters, with McFarlane owning the other 50%. This was the agreement Gaiman and McFarlane made prior to Gaiman writing any scripts. Again, this was a verbal agreement, with no written contract. Gaiman spent years attempting to receive royalties for items such as trade paperbacks and toys featuring these co-created characters. Suddenly, McFarlane claimed that Gaiman didn't own any rights, since there was no written contract between them, and he refused to compensate Gaiman any further. Gaiman then took legal action against McFarlane. The ensuing 10-year court battle over this issue is rather complex, so only the relevant points require a mention. At one point, McFarlane offered to trade the rights to Miracleman for the rights to Cogliostro and Medieval Spawn. Gaiman accepted this trade. Then McFarlane changed his mind and decided he didn't want to do a trade. The lawsuit proceeded forward. Eventually, in 2002, Gaiman won his case against McFarlane. Gaiman had the option of either taking the original deal of trading Miracleman for Cogliostro and Medieval Spawn, or working out a new deal. Gaiman did not take the rights to Miracleman and decided on financial compensation instead. This was a surprising decision on Gaiman's part. After all, one of the expressed main points of this legal battle was to acquire the Miracleman rights. However, in the years during the legal battle, one very important piece of information was discovered by Gaiman and his legal team. It's the reason why Gaiman passed on this trade with McFarlane at the end of the court battle. In the original contract between Des Skin and Eclipse Comics, there was a clause that stated if ownership of the company changed hands, or if the company went out of business, all rights to the Miracleman character reverted back to Skin. Basically, all that McFarlane had bought when he purchased those Eclipse assets was an expired trademark for the Miracleman logo, not the character of Miracleman. For the record, the legal case between Gaiman and McFarlane wasn't finally resolved until 2012, 10 years after Gaiman had originally won. However, the actual terms of that settlement are confidential. So, at the end of this legal battle, the copyright to Miracleman appeared to be owned by Neil Gaiman, 15%, Mark Buckingham, 15%, Des Skin, 10%, Alan Davis, 30%, and Gary Leach, 30%. But this distribution of copyright is based on the presumption that Des Skin had the right in the first place to offer a share of the Miracleman character to all these various people, which is something he apparently never had. The final twist came in 2009, when Marvel Comics announced they had purchased the rights to Miracleman. Furthermore, Marvel intended to reprint the entire series again, and they heavily implied they were going to publish new issues to be written by Neil Gaiman and illustrated by Mark Buckingham. This would, presumably, finish off the saga that Gaiman intended to write in the early 90s. Well, that's not exactly what happened. Marvel's announcement only concerned reprinting the series, which they did starting in 2014. Marvel made sure they had contracts with all the prior creators and properly compensated them for their material. Alan Moore deferred credit and payment due to some editing of the language that appeared in his original scripts. However, new Miracleman material did not materialize, despite implications that new material was imminent. Then, in 2017, Marvel announced they would print the Silver Age, which was the Gaiman and Buckingham story they started before Eclipse folded. This series, which would require new material, was subsequently postponed indefinitely without an explanation. The following year, Marvel announced they finalized all the legal hurdles that had postponed the publication of the Silver Age, which they intended to publish in 2019. This was a curious announcement, due to the fact that it was presumed the copyright issue had been previously resolved. Regardless, Marvel has not elaborated on what prevented them from publishing new material. So, there was one final piece missing in this puzzle. Neil Gaiman had been working in conjunction with Marvel Comics to settle the lawsuit with Todd McFarlane and to determine who owned Miracleman. They had actually formed a company, Marvels and Miracles, LLC, in 2001 for this specific purpose. During the McFarlane legal battle, they discovered that not only had McFarlane purchased the rights to nothing, but they also discovered that Des Skin hadn't done all the necessary homework to ensure he had the right to print Miracleman in Warrior. In other words, not only had Gaiman and Marvel discovered that McFarlane owned nothing, but that same nothing applied to all others who believed they owned a piece of Miracleman. This included Gaiman's own gifted share from Alan Moore and all of the other shares owned by all the other creators. This begs the question, how could Marvel assert they had acquired the rights to the Miracleman character since it looked like no one actually owned it? It all comes back to Mick Anglo, who asserted he owned the character around the time Eclipse was reprinting the Warrior material. In fact, Eclipse was in negotiations with Anglo over his rights at the time they went out of business. When Eclipse declared bankruptcy, the issue wasn't settled, and Anglo presumed he still held the rights. The point being, these negotiations established that Anglo believed he had a claim to the character. Whether or not that claim was valid is another story. According to Poisoned Chalice, Anglo possibly sold these perceived rights to another company and then returned to enjoying his retirement. Presumably, it was this company that Marvel negotiated with and subsequently acquired the Miracle rights from. But it should be noted, this is speculation. Marvel has not confirmed any details concerning this acquisition. As of 2022, 5 years after the original announcement, new Miracleman material is being published by Marvel. It's safe to say they now actually own the character. If they hadn't done their due diligence, they wouldn't move forward with any project using Miracleman. That would be a lawsuit waiting to happen. The silence regarding the issue may be due to contractual agreements, and, during any negotiations that may have occurred, they didn't want to give the competition any sign that the copyright was still in question or a bidding war could have erupted. Again, this is all speculation, but all things considered, not unreasonable. As for the delay between the announcement of the Silver Age and it being published, this is possibly due to Neil Gaiman. He's simply a busy fellow with obligations to many different projects. So, presumably, until the copyright issue was resolved and a hole in Gaiman's schedule was found, little or no actual work was done. So with the publication of the Silver Age and the new original material within, it can be said that the long and convoluted copyright issue has finally been resolved. Or has it? Yeah, it has. This is pretty conclusive. All that's left to say is, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, comment, and all that good stuff. Additional thanks to all those that directly support this channel and help keep the lights on. I appreciate every single one of you. Thank you.